Pokémon Ultra Sun and Pokémon Ultra Moon. These are the definitive editions of the flagship Generation 7 titles. And I want to take another walk through these games, and in some areas Gen 7 in general, because this generation of Pokémon games was significant in many ways. They experimented a lot, and they challenged what a mainline Pokémon game is down to its very core. They were the final Pokémon games to release on the Nintendo 3DS, and so the final games of the handheld era. Some people praised them for being bold and stepping outside of the rigid formula, while others berated them for maybe being a little too unhinged from the Pokémon we know. We're going to talk about all of that. So grab your Moo Moo Milk and Malasadas, we're heading back to Alola for a retrospective of Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Our adventure begins with a Skype call. This was 2017, a lot of us were still clinging onto Skype then, where this region's professor, Professor Kukui, welcomes us to the world of Pokémon. He calls us cousin, which I think that's just a common colloquialism where this region is based on, which is Hawaii. More on that later. I don't think he's actually our cousin, not from what I can learn online anyway. But we learn here that our character is about to move to the Alola region, which is something I feel like we do a lot in Pokémon games. Very often our character isn't actually from the region we're playing in, which I'm kind of unsure about my feelings towards. I kinda want the core characters to be native to that region, but it's a fun change of pace here and there. We then punch into a cutscene where a young girl is being chased around what looks like a greenhouse kind of thing, before a mysterious light shoots up from her bag and ta-da! Title card. I'll probably forget this cutscene ever happened, to be honest, but that was a nice little tease for the story. Okay, now we're in the game, and this looks so vibrant and beautiful. I'm instantly in love with the aesthetics of these games. I will mention that I am playing this game upscaled a little bit, but regardless of that, this looks great to me. Ultra Sun Ultra Moon takes a smidgen of inspiration from Hoenn, in having the starter Pokémon step in and thwart a wild Pokémon attacking a human, proving once again that living in the Pokémon world would not be the utopian wonderland we all romanticize. In these games we have Rowlet, Litten, and Popplio. It's an easy choice for me, Litten, every day of the week. I love this little guy. Or should I say girl? I got a female Litten in this playthrough without even trying, so that was cool. The early game is dominated by a lot of cutscenes and dialogue. It's not quite as brutal as the original Sun and Moon games for this, but there's a fair bit of padding here before you feel like you've truly been let loose into the world. One of the first things we do is venture up Mahalo Trail and find the girl we saw from that opening cutscene. Okay, maybe I will remember it. And she immediately asks for our help as her Pokémon is on the middle of the bridge, getting circled by a bunch of angry-looking Spearow. You know, I really dislike the antagonist image Spearow has always been stamped with. I love Spearow. I wish they'd stop painting it as a villain so much. Anyway, we kinda save the little cloud Pokémon, but end up taking a fall when it destroys the bridge from under us. But then we're saved by a mysterious, legendary-looking beast, who we're told afterwards is a guardian of the island. The girl here, whose name is Lily, asks us not to tell anyone about this little Pokémon she has here, which she calls Nebby. Sus. So we've sort of set the scene for a lot of the mystery within these games. Who is Lily? What is this Pokémon she has? And why does it need to be kept a secret? What exactly was that thing that just saved us from certain death? What role will it play later on? Okay Alola, you've got me. I'm right there. Let's push on. What we push on into though is a lot more introductory stuff. It does sort of feel like every 20 steps, we're plunged into another heavy bout of dialogue. I've said this in videos before, I try my best to think about completely new players when it comes to these long, drawn-out tutorial sections of the games, but this is a lot to push through. You do need to have a fair degree of patience. The trainer school on Route 1 felt a little overkill. I feel like you could have cut that completely, but it's something a tad different. I'm always for Game Freak trying new things. Something else we're introduced to early on in the game is the Island Challenge. This is perhaps the biggest shift from the formula we've ever seen in mainline Pokémon, because Pokémon gyms are not a thing in these games. Instead, we'll be travelling from island to island completing a set of trials. These trials involve, well, battling Pokémon. You're still doing Pokémon battles to progress, obviously, but there's a new spice to how it's done in these games. So during the trials, typically you'll defeat a couple of weaker Pokémon on the way to facing off against what is called a totem Pokémon, which are typically bigger than usual. They have a special aura that surrounds them that boosts their stats quite significantly. and they do pose quite a challenge. I actually found that most of the challenge comes from a second Pokemon they can call upon. It's a new mechanic in this generation where a Pokemon can call for help, and some sort of ally Pokemon will appear next to it, making it a 1v2 battle. SOS Battles is the name of this, and we'll touch on those in a bit. One thing I would change about these totem battles would be having the battle end when the totem Pokemon is defeated. Because on multiple occasions during my playthroughs, I've defeated the totem Pokemon, but then I've just been sort of left awkwardly battling the Pokemon it called for help. It just feels a bit anticlimactic when that happens. But these are fun. I think it was really cool that Game Freak broke the formula in this way. It's still familiar enough while also feeling like a novelty. The trials aren't evenly distributed. There are more trials on some islands than others, but after you've completed the trials on each island, you'll then take part in what's called a Grand Trial, which involves battling the Kahuna of the island. The Kahuna is basically someone who's entrusted to preside over the island. And you could argue that they're kinda like gym leaders. They sort of fill that role a little bit. There is an extra trial that was introduced in the Ultra versions of these games, initiated by Mina in Seafolk Village. This one involves going around and defeating the captains of each island. Kahunas, captains, yeah, it's a little convoluted. The captains are the ones who trained the totem Pokemon you battle against in these trials. Except now you're battling them themselves. Now it definitely does feel like I'm just battling gym leaders again. And in quick succession as well. The captain you've just defeated offers to escort you directly to the next one. So it's a long campaign, filled with a lot of Pokemon battling. Don't worry if you skip a trainer or 6 on any of the routes, your Pokemon will level up just fine in these games. I mostly like the whole island trial thing. It's broken the gym formula in the most chaotic way, and I can only applaud that. They were very strange to play through the game with in the sense that gym badges are sort of a marker for how far you are into the game. And more so the fact that each island doesn't have an evenly distributed number of trials did make the game feel like more of a slog to me. I didn't really get that same checkpoint feeling as I was playing through the game. I mean, that could just be a me thing. That's just how I felt making my way through this facet of the game. It all culminates in the Pokémon League, which apparently is the first ever Pokémon League championships in Alola. In the past, Alola used to hold a final island trial, where the challenger must defeat all the Kahunas again, but this time one after the other. A bit like an Elite Four really. But that has since been replaced by a bona fide Pokémon League, built atop Alola's highest mountain. And they're a mixed bunch. Not gonna lie, I was kinda scared they'd just be the island Kahunas or captains again. And a couple of them are. We've got Olivia the Kahuna, and Acerola the captain, but the other two are a bit more creative. There's Mullane, who's a former captain, and Kahili, who's a former Island Challenge champion from when it did take place in the old format. And I think it's fun that some of the most recent generations of Pokemon games let you take on the Elite Four in any order you like. I did them in linear order from left to right, just because I am a bit of a traditionalist, but it's cool that you get that choice, so you can strategize your route through the Pokemon League if you want to. The champion battle in the Ultra games is against your rival Hau, which kinda makes sense. In the original games it was against Professor Kukui. I definitely prefer it to that. I think the Professor also being the champion is a bit of a crossover too far. I was happy with the Pokemon League in these games, to sum up. It was definitely diverse enough to be engaging. Speaking of diverse, the Alola region adds a lot of diversity to the Pokemon world. The map spans across 4 main islands, and there's also the Aether Paradise and Executor Island tagged on there too. It's of course based on the real-life US state of Hawaii, so there's a very tropical theme across the entirety of the region. Each island does have its own unique identity though. Mele Mele is a hub for festivals and traditional events. Akala has its abundance of ecosystems and volcanic areas. Ula Ula has a lot of history and different cultural influences peppered in there. And Pony Island is perhaps more of an enigma, having its strong connections to legendary Pokemon. I think on my first playthrough of these games, the multiple islands makeup of the map got a little confusing. I kept forgetting what particular towns and landmarks were on which island. But as you learn more and more about the islands individually, you actually start to be able to make educated guesses about those things, until eventually they become ingrained in your memory. And it does become quite fun once you do properly know your way around, because you develop biases for which islands you like to hang around on during your downtime. Does that make sense? Do you guys even do that? Do you ever just have a bit of downtime mid-game and spend a bit of time going back and aimlessly walking around particular locations? I feel like that's something we don't do as often in modern times. A lot of us tend to hammer through the games at lightning pace, myself very much included sometimes. But I really love Melee Melee Island. Hau'oli City is my base. I'd 100% live there. I do find it very intriguing that there isn't really a starting town in Alola. Iki Town, you could sort of argue, fulfills that role, but our house is actually situated on Route 1, which I'm all for, to be fair. A lot of starting towns lately have been barely perceivable as towns. I'm looking at you, Cabopoko. So just having the house being on Route 1 in that situation probably suits a lot better. I do think as well, and this is something that pinged up in my head at the very start of the playthrough as we pan into Melee Melee Island, the whole island is visible in this shot, showing that even the quote-unquote out-of-bounds areas are fleshed out and accounted for. The map from above doesn't look like this, for example. It's all there. So, Alola would be a very easy region to convert to an open-world map in the future. I'm just saying. It would be cool to be able to seamlessly travel around the islands. And between the islands too. Imagine if you could surf or fly between the islands. I have never been much of an open-world advocate. I'd rather the game just perform well, but I'm pointing out a possibility. I'd be happy enough if just each of the islands were their own open area of the map. Just a thought though. There's a lot of lore to unpack in these games. There are many branches to the story of Alola. Sort of more subtly sprinkled in during the base game is the significance of each island's guardian. The Tapus are deities. They watch over Alola, and each one symbolises a different role in protecting the islands and keeping the balance of nature. The only real interaction we have with them in the base game is when one of the Tapus saves us at the very beginning when we fall from that bridge. Then it's the post game when we meet them properly. They're a bit of an acquired taste in my opinion. They are cool, but you sort of have to spend a little time learning about them to realise it. I actually still get confused with their names sometimes, but I'm getting there. It's largely because there is a shared design element between them all. Tapu Fini is my favourite of the four though. Feel free to let me know yours in the comments. The main story of these games actually kinda centres around Lily, and this mysterious little cloud Pokemon she's always hiding in her bag. You'd be forgiven for thinking Lily was going to be a rival of some sort in the opening stretch of the game, but she isn't. We don't battle her at any point either. We battle with her in a double battle at one point at the Aether Paradise Island, but that's all we see of her battling. Lily isn't a Pokemon trainer really. In fact, I kinda saw her as the main character in these games, just with us doing the dirty work on her behalf. She's determined to protect this little Cosmog she has from the Aether Foundation, an organisation headquartered at this little island called Aether Paradise, whose goal is supposedly Pokemon protection and conservation. But much like any organisation in the world of Pokemon, they aren't all they appear to be. The head of the Aether Foundation, Lusamine, has a bit of an obsession with Ultra Beasts. These Pokemon from completely alternate dimensions that we'll touch on in a bit more detail in a few minutes. Lusamine comes across as pretty unstable. She loves Pokemon, but to the polar extreme of neglecting her own children. Oh yeah, Lusamine is Lily's mother too. I'm trying to stay anchored to the Ultra Games version of Lusamine, because she is quite different in the original Sun and Moon games. But I do think I prefer the Ultra Sun and Moon Lusamine more. I think her arc as a villain has more tension to it in these games. You're a bit more sympathetic to the Lusamine in the originals. Her actions are very extreme. She even has some Pokemon frozen to preserve them, which is just the creepiest thing when you first see it. So the Aether Foundation she heads is trying to use Cosmog for its unique abilities to create Ultra Wormholes, which connect the Pokemon world to other dimensions. So Lusamine can find and defeat Necrozma, a legendary extra-dimensional Pokemon that she thinks could potentially steal the light from this world. And this ties in with the Ultra Recon Squad, these funky dressed people here who come from another world that Necrozma has already stolen light from, and are here to protect Alola from potentially meeting the same fate. We run into them at least a dozen times throughout our journey. There's a lot of backstory to these people and their past experiences with Necrozma and the Alola region, and we get a little bit more drip-fed to us during each of these encounters. And they're sort of preparing us for the eventual big battle we have with Necrozma to eliminate the threat to Alola. It's a good story with a lot of intertwining layers to it. It's actually kinda difficult to sum up. This video could easily be 3 hours long if we really went in on all the details. And that actually segues nicely to a large and widely discussed problem with both Sun and Moon and the Ultra versions, which is the absolute wall of dialogue in these games. There are people who will tell you to get over it and build a better attention span, but it is taken to an extreme in these games. Whatever your stance on it, that much we have to admit. And I think it does the games a bit of a disservice, because the lore is so expansive in Alola. And I feel like a lot of people aren't experiencing it, or are missing a lot of things because at certain points they've just gotten sick of the text boxes and started button mashing to push themselves through the game. And I get it. I'm one of those people who, upon reaching a new town, likes to spend a few minutes looking around, talking to random NPCs, generally just getting a feel for the place. But in these games, you don't get the freedom to do that. It feels like every 30 feet you're dragged into another novel chapter's worth of dialogue. People have described it as hand-holding, but I wouldn't use that phrase personally, because it sounds a bit too gentle for what's going on here. You aren't being walked through the experience. You are being dragged kicking and screaming in many places. At the start of the game, I thought it was just the usual tutorial you have to grin and bear through as a returning player, but it just carried on through most of the game. For that reason, the 7th generation games for me have to be something you come into knowing that you're going to be taking things slow. Your expectations need to be set. That's the only way you're going to get true value out of these titles. Be prepared to interact a fair bit less compared to other games. And I think it also gives the game less replayability, because the first time through was fine for me. I'm a bit of a dork who likes reading anyway, but coming back to play through them again, it is definitely a bit like, come on. The constant dialogue feels a lot more disruptive and invasive the second time through. Great story. Like I said, you could make one hell of a deep dive out of it all. It's just maybe a victim of its own grandiosity, in that it requires too much compulsory dialogue to keep you in the loop. That said, there's plenty of stuff you could just cut and it'd be okay. Let me know where you stand on the dialogue issue in the comments. Let's briefly jump over and look at the rivals in these games. Hau is the grandson of Mele Mele Island's Kahuna. He's the main rival. He shows a lot of enthusiasm for the Island Challenge, but he has a very casual, laid-back approach to competitive battling. He's sort of just in it for the fun of the game. That's how it comes across. But he also has some depth in wanting to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and become a protector of the Alola region. So, friendly rival, competes alongside you to become the champion, but he's very laid back about competing, but he is determined to be strong to protect the region. His character's a bit whiplashy on the surface, but I did feel like I saw some growth in Hau over the course of my playthrough. I think his carefree, fun-loving nature does dilute a little bit as you enter the later half of the games, in place of a genuine competitor who's a lot more assured and confident, and mature as well. Hau was kind of insufferable to me at the beginning, and while he still does the hyperactive cheerleader jumps all the way to the end, the dialogue that fronts that shows some real character growth. Rival characters sort of spill over into the evil team in these games, so let's get a bit more acquainted with them. Should I even use the phrase evil team anymore? It doesn't feel accurate with more recent ones. Antagonist teams, maybe? Team Skull is that team in the Gen 7 titles. And this is one of the most interesting teams we've had in Pokémon. First, you have to get past the facade, because this weird little faux intimidation tactic with the funky arm movements, there's no other word for it, it's just funny. But it's by design for sure. Team Skull is made up of a bunch of disenfranchised youths, kids who tried and failed the Island Challenge, and now feel directionless, like they've lost all sense of purpose. It's a fascinating socio-economic side to Alola, in that the Island Challenge is kind of the thing for trainers in Alola, almost like a rite of passage. Failing it doesn't really leave you with much to shout about, and so these misfits find a sense of belonging in each other, and form a group which, let's be honest, don't do a hell of a lot. You can tell by what NPCs say about them that they're a nuisance at best. They hassle people, they do their best to look intimidating, but underneath they're just a group of lost rebels. They're headed by Guzma, who does look the most intimidating of the lot, which is probably how he rose to the top of the hierarchy. He also formed the group. Because he failed the Island Challenge, he's incredibly critical of the whole system. He gets roped into the whole Ultra Space saga as well. He's manipulated to help out with Lucamine's plans. Perhaps he feels like this could be something that renews his sense of purpose. But instead he finds himself getting humbled by the whole experience, and it leads him to eventually disbanding Team Skull to try and rebuild as a Pokémon trainer. Plumeria is a surprising character in Team Skull too. She's referred to as the big sister of the group, which is quite fitting. She's a grounding force within the team. She spends half the time being antagonistic, and half the time showing concern and trying to guide the other Team Skull members. I think Plumeria is the perfect window into Team Skull's DNA, because she's level-headed. She's one of them, but very much able to control and channel the rebellion that encapsulates the cause. There's also Gladion. He joined Team Skull for different reasons, but still reasons of disenchantment. He's more of a lone wolf type, and far more assured in himself than anyone else in Team Skull. He is also one of Lucimine's children. We've been introduced to both of them now, and his motivations come from a place of resistance against the Aether Foundation's plans. He spends some time being a rival to us, and some being a key ally, and the evolution from one to the other is another gradual and rewarding thing to see happen. So yeah, a very intricate antagonist team with a lot of moving parts, a lot of different personalities and sources of motivation. I'll admit, in my first playthrough of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, I didn't appreciate Team Skull that much at all. I almost completely dismissed them as an inconsequential prop piece. But there's a lot going on with them. I'm kinda tempted to make a dedicated video on Team Skull at some point to dig a little deeper. So we touched on Necrozma earlier. Necrozma's lingering power from a long time ago is the underlying force behind Z-Power, which sounds like something that belongs in Dragon Ball, but it's actually what powers this region's battle mechanic, Z-moves. Works a little bit like Mega Evolution in the previous generation, in the sense that they require a held item to be used. They're called Z-Crystals, and there's one for each type you can collect along your journey. Z-moves are a powered up version of a Pokemon's attack, and they're a once per battle thing, so make sure you don't waste it on breaking Mimikyu's disguise like I did. And whatever type Z-Crystal you give to your Pokemon, that's the type of Z-move it can use. So attach a Fire Z-Crystal to Litten, and any of its Fire-type moves can be used as the Fire-type Z-move, once. There's also Pokemon-specific Z-Crystals you can obtain, which turn a specific move, if that Pokemon knows it, into a bespoke Z-move with a special, unique animation. For example, my Incineroar holding Insinium Z changes the specific move Darkest Lariat into the special Z-move Malicious Moonsault. And that is the only reason I evolved my Torracat to Incineroar during this playthrough. Because, come on, I love Torracat. Sometimes the middle stage is better than the final stage. This is one of those times. Fight me. Each type of Z-move also comes with its own pose that the player character strikes when it's activated, which is equally as ridiculous as Team Skull's little dance. The Dark type one just looks so awkward. I'm a little indifferent on Z-moves as a battle gimmick. They're kinda neat, I just don't really have strong feelings either way about them. In fact, I think I went through my entire first playthrough of Pokémon Sun without using them, so they're definitely not compulsory. Imagine if it was like a 5th move instead, and you could give any Pokemon any type of Z-Crystal. That'd throw an interesting spanner in the works. But absolutely, let me know what you think of Z-moves in the comments. This same Z-Power is what supercharges the Totem Pokemon we face in the Island Trials, and gives them that orangey-yellow aura. We can receive these very Totem Pokemon as gifts from Samsung Oak. Yes, this is a relative of the famous Professor Oak, after we collect certain numbers of totem stickers, which you can just see glistening on random walls inside and outside throughout the map. So that's a little side quest if you're interested in doing that. SOS battles is something we also touched on earlier, and these don't just happen in the Island Trials, they can happen with just regular wild encounters too. At the end of a turn, if a wild Pokemon is standing by itself, it has a chance to call for another wild Pokemon to help it. Sometimes that call doesn't work, and no Pokemon comes to its aid, and sometimes a Pokemon that can't be found via any other method will spawn in. It's a funky little mechanic that's super fun for shiny hunting actually. I've never tried it myself, but I know a couple of streamer buddies who have employed this method quite often. It does look fun. It can also be annoying if you're just trying to catch a Pokemon, but I definitely prefer it to black and white straight up double battles, for example. They're just that bit easier to navigate. Speaking of navigating, these games give us the power to call upon many ride Pokemon to help us navigate the world. 8 in total across the entire game, and each one has a specific power that mimics HMs. Tauros can Rock Smash, Machamp can Strength, Lapras can Surf, and so on. I've always been kind of outspoken about my disdain for having multiple ride Pokemon. It's a damn sight better than HMs, don't get me wrong. But there's something about simply replacing it with the same thing, but the Pokemon just aren't part of your party, that just doesn't feel quite right to me. Scarlet and Violet actually did it quite well with the ride legendaries, and weaved it into the story brilliantly. But obviously we can't do that with every game. I would honestly just rather gain items for these HM purposes. A bike for land, a surfboard for water, a laser gun for rock smashing or something, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I have the answers off the top of my head, but you get my point. The ride Pokemon in these games aren't even new Pokemon introduced in Gen 7, which brings us to the Pokédex. I feel like I could get scolded for this, but Alola's Pokédex is not my favourite. There are a select few Pokemon that I really love from this generation, Rockruff, Pippipeck, Sandygast, but most of the rest aren't doing much for me. The starters are really good though, a really strong lineup. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not an Incineroar fan, but aside from that, I am a fan of this entire lineup. I've had a playthrough with each of them at this point and enjoyed using every one of them. Solid 9 out of 10 for the starters, or first partner Pokemon I think we're supposed to call them officially. Rubbish name. I used to really dislike the Ultra Beasts, but that was actually before I played these games and learned about what they actually were. When I was on hiatus from Pokemon games, I'd still periodically look at the Pokemon website to see what new Pokemon had been released, and I remember seeing this page of the Pokédex and being like, oh my god, what the hell has Pokemon become? But they're literally from different dimensions. They're supposed to look insane and weird. So I actually like a lot of them now after educating myself in that area. Celesteela is my favourite one. Me saying that the majority of Alolan Pokemon don't do anything for me doesn't mean I actively dislike them, they just don't excite me. In fact no, there is one Pokemon I do genuinely dislike here, more than any other Pokemon in the entire franchise actually. This thing can yeet itself into the sun. But apart from that, it's alright. At least these games were before Dexit happened, so we can transfer in any Pokemon we want from earlier generations to create our ideal team. So let's start to wrap up by talking about the end game of Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. This involves us and Lily playing the Sun and Moon flutes atop one of the two altars in Alola, depending on which version you're playing, in our attempts to reach her mother, Lusamine, who disappeared into an Ultra Wormhole earlier on. And this causes Nebby to evolve into the Box Legendary. This was mad to me. The Box Legendaries of these games are 3-stage evolution lines. That's new. Anyway, this also summons Necrozma from another dimension, spitting out Lusamine and Guzma in the process. Our Box Legend attempts to fight off Necrozma, but not only does it get overpowered, but it gets absorbed by Necrozma, which is just horrifying to watch. The immense power this emits causes wormholes to open all across Alola, with Ultra Beasts attacking every island. After we defeat this new form of Necrozma, it slips away into another wormhole, taking Alola's light with it. Yep, it's actually happened. This final chapter kicking into motion was the payoff I'd been waiting for during the whole grind through these games. To actually see this immense power we've been hearing about firsthand, and the threat finally manifesting itself, this is the excitement we were waiting for. So this is where Ultra Warp rides are introduced to us, where we can ride either one of the Box Legendaries to distant dimensions light years away. This time around we're looking to reach Necrozma, but I did get sucked into a different warp hole first and caught myself a Nuzleaf. Actually turned out to be a very helpful mishap. When we do reach Ultra Megalopolis, god that's a mouthful, 2 recon members greet us and inform us that Necrozma is now wild and out of control, and it's up to us to quell the beast, which manifests in yet another form when we reach it, Ultra Necrozma. This is kind of the ultimate totem Pokemon battle, and it's difficult. It one-shotted a lot of my team before I found a strat to eventually whittle its health down to 0. And we saved the world, or the Alola region at the very least. Necrozma can then be found later on incredibly weakened during our climb up Mount Larnaquila to the Pokemon League. Catch that, quick detour back to Mahalo Trail where Lily entrusts us to catch the Box Legendary, and we have a very powerful fused legendary Pokemon in our possession for the Pokemon League. I typically don't use legendaries in a playthrough, but I've never used a fusion of Necrozma and one of the Box Legends, so I wanted to give it a go. And it was very good. Very useful against Olivia's rock types. The credits in these games are so good. I did not expect myself to be making a whole point of the credits, but these are the best credits we've had in a Pokemon game so far, 100%. I love how they play out like those sort of slice of life scenes at the end of a Pokemon movie. It's so wholesome and emotional, and wraps up a lot of characters' story arcs without even needing any dialogue over the top. We can grasp what's happening without it, if you've been paying attention to the dialogue throughout the game. as well as teasing a few things you can seek out in the post-game. The credits are always unskippable, so usually you just rest your console down while the game slides through them, but here you actually want to keep watching. I definitely got a bit emotional watching this. This was a 10 out of 10 decision on Game Freak's part. Please do this again in a future game, I loved it so much. So, Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. There's so much to unpack in these games, and I've only really covered the key areas in this video to avoid going into feature film-length territory on a game that's nearly a decade old. And there's a whole bunch of activities in the post-game, and an epilogue that I want to cover in its own video too, because that's its own crazy thing. Whenever I get around to that, I'll come back and pin it to the comments. These games are an unhinged wonder of the mainline series. They broke so many rules when it comes to the Pokémon formula, but was it a success? I like to think so. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the egregious amount of unskippable dialogue is what mainly lets the games down. Behind that, there's a great story, a fascinatingly multi-layered evil team, multiple characters facing their own nuanced struggles, all taking place in a region that has so much vibrance and personality, and lore that you could write a whole novel about. I do think that these titles have a lot going for them. We're light years away from remakes at this point. See how I got a sneaky Ultra Wormhole reference in there? But if and when these titles are remade, I'd rework them so that the main stuff stays front and center, and the good to know but not totally essential stuff is optional dialogue you're just heavily encouraged to consume. What are your thoughts on these games? God help you if these were your first ever Pokemon games. I'd be very interested to hear how that shaped your Pokemon experience, if that is the case for any of you guys. But like them or not, these games were bold with what they did. I wouldn't be totally opposed to Game Freak creating something like this again. Just let me trigger my own cutscenes if that's okay.